on to our final petition of the evening. This is case number Z012-23. And I believe we have Jackie again to present.
Jackie Scanlon, Development Services Manager. We are looking at tonight text amendment. And we saw this last month. So we had our regular annual UDO update text amendment that we brought to you in March of this year. And one of the things that you removed was a text amendment related to maximum parking standards that we were proposing to add to those uses that didn't currently have maximum parking standards. So we met with a small group of Plan Commission members who had expressed interest, as well as met internally and looked at those numbers again. We proposed a couple of changes, a few changes, so we'll just go over the proposal again tonight, and then we can try to answer any questions you have. Additionally, the council is bringing forward changes to the chicken flock regulations in Title VII, and Title 20 references those. So there is one text amendment related to chicken flocks because the current use-specific standard talks about a chicken flock, and they are going to propose to allow multiple chicken flocks, so that has been changed to chicken flocks plural. So that is part of this amendment as well. So as you will recall, we have a table in the UDO, table 04-10, and it lists all of our uses from the use table and assigns maximum parking standards to those uses. So we have 47 uses in that table that have limits currently, and then we are proposing changes to the 68 other uses that either don't have a limit at all, 58 of them don't have any limit, and then 10 we're proposing to make some changes to additionally. So one of the things we talked about when we met last time was kind of why would we need parking maximums? So for a few reasons. One is obviously for consistency for petitioners. It is odd that almost half of our uses have maximums and the other half don't. We went back to look through the paperwork for the process that we did with the consultant when we updated the code in 2019 and 2020. And when we looked at the 2019 UDO, a number of the uses that are now listed as no limit had person-based limits at that time, which is a hard standard to regulate. So for example, vehicle impound storage was listed as one space per employee on largest shift. So we had a number of uses like that in the old code. So it seems that the consultant, as a way to address that, changed a number of those to no limit. And so we are proposing to change those basically to site-based requirements, as our other uses are. For example, a certain number of spaces per square footage of use of the building. So we think that will be helpful from a use standpoint if they are all regulated in a similar way. Also from an administration standpoint for staff as well. Additionally, our policy guidelines in the comprehensive plan do call out in a couple of places that we put in the staff report that the comprehensive plan does want us to minimize area of land dedicated to parking. So storage of vehicles, and in this case, the code uses that you see are mostly temporary storage of vehicles, right? So it's not long-term land designated for vehicular uses. in a more permanent fashion, but for temporary uses while you're utilizing that business. So something that's not full all the time. So in a couple of places here, we noted both in the downtown and in the urban corridor design guidelines, indicating that trying to identify strategies where we'll be lessening large open asphalt spaces is important and something that we're wanting to do. So we're trying to address that as well. We had a member of the public come and who had a couple questions about a couple of the specific uses. So we put in some information. We presented a little bit of it last time, but for example, jail. So one thing, that we want to make clear is we're not trying to regulate out the use of vehicles. Obviously, the community is still heavily reliant on vehicles. I think almost everyone here probably used one to get here this evening. We realize that uses need parking. We are just trying to make sure that that parking is in relatable scale to the use that's going on in the building. So looking at the uses that are already regulated or looking at uses that we're proposing to regulate in how they're addressed in other communities is something that we've done, as well as looking at guidance from our professional planning organization. So trying to not only internally compare, but compare with similar communities in Indiana, also communities in Indiana that aren't similar, but do have maximums, aren't similar, I would say, ideologically, but do have maximums. And as well as communities that have the types of uses that we might currently do not have regulations for right now. So those types of things are included. For example, the jail comparison here for how many spaces that they actually propose on site, as well as what our regulation would allow. And then again, stadium was brought up, so some examples for those. For the more general uses that we see every day, we again tried to compare the use, what is actually going on in the building for each use, and are there similar uses already in code that could be comparable where we're not seeing issues with the spaces that are allowed for those uses. I will say, we are of course open to changing these numbers if anyone has specific ideas. And additionally, we do track the number of variances we do for these. So I know that came up last time. Since 2020, we've had 4 parking maximum variances, and they were largely for restaurants. 4 that were, 5, and 3 were for restaurants. And so that's something we have proposed in this update to increase the allowable parking for restaurants. We've also proposed to increase the allowable parking for fitness center, because that was another that we've seen come forward describing, indicating that yes, they needed a variance, and then we looked deeper and decided to increase those numbers. So it's something that we're always open to. And we haven't had, as I said, we've had those 5 come forward. We haven't had a lot of issues with this max parking, with the max parking numbers that we do currently have in the last few years. So, just generally, we believe that adding maximums to the allowable amount of surface parking for all the uses is in line with city goals, as I mentioned, encourages green space, encourages space for people and buildings, as opposed to necessarily designating space for vehicles only, still allowing area for that, but allowing area for other things as well. I think one thing we could address that was discussed, that was brought up by Plan Commissioner, I think that this is especially important for those areas of town that we have that haven't developed yet. So for example, when we're talking about like the Fullerton site that we saw with the county, while the impervious surface coverage maximum also limits development on sites, for large sites, that's not going to be an issue. For example, at the Fullerton site, they were only going to be able to develop at all 30% of that site. And if they were to choose a use that didn't have a parking maximum, then they would be able to just basically put as much parking as they could fit, which on a site like that would be acres and acres of parking, which just doesn't seem congruous to us with the long-term goals of the community. So for example, 1 acre is around 320 parking spaces. So not a parking lot with 320 spaces, but the actual dimensions for 320 spaces. So, when we see these uses that we think may end up needing a lot of parking, they may need to think about a model of shared parking or structured parking to be able to get to be able to utilize the land that they have in a more efficient way, as opposed to, they need 600 parking spaces because they're building a new stadium of some kind. Oh, we're going to do that on 4 acres or whatever that may be. That's something that we're trying to avoid, those outliers. And I think that the numbers that we have proposed are reasonable enough that is what we'll be catching as outliers. If we're wrong and some numbers for the specific ones do come forward to the Board of Zoning Appeals, that's something that we're happy to address in our yearly update to change those items. And some, we do want it to be right. We're trying to strike a balance between the goals for economic viability and the environment, and making this as much of a pedestrian-friendly community as possible. And those things, it's not always super clear how to do that, but we think this policy moves toward that, and we are still open, of course, to amending it if need be. So we ask that you forward the petition that we submitted to you in the packet related to chicken flock and maximum parking update to the Common Council with a positive recommendation. I can answer any questions.
Thank you, Jackie. Are there any questions from commissioners? No questions. You do have one?
All right, I have one question. Okay, just to be consistent in the use of the S in chicken flocks, does it need to be added to the accessory use table too? Does the S need to be added?
No, I don't
I appreciate
think
that the
so.
chicken flocks don't need additional parking. But,
No,
but I don't know
so, because you could still have one.
okay,
Yeah.
okay, all right. Yeah, I think this is really interesting. I appreciate what you're trying to accomplish with the maximum, and to be consistent throughout. I think it's really great. And the other part that I really appreciate is that you've already demonstrated your capacity and willingness to make changes to restaurants and fitness after having seen what was necessary. So I really appreciate that.
Commissioner Cochran.
So, Ms. Scanlon or Jackie, we spoke briefly earlier. Can you describe, with the change in use, there's the limited compliance. Can you kind of explain that a little bit? And I guess the challenge that I'm having, and we've talked about this, is it's just for removing parking and what some people would consider an asset, just the cost burden that it can put on a property owner or a future tenant to come in and, say, remove 10 parking spaces. I completely see the point, but it's making it very challenging on properties that have been vacant to put them into use.
Sure.
So just would like to have a little bit more conversation.
Sure. I'm just going to show a little example, and then I'll probably let Eric describe it because he does it better than I do. But this is an example we brought up last time, and I couldn't think of the address, so we didn't look at it. But this is out on Profile Parkway. It's the old Upland location. The maximum impervious surface coverage here is 70%. This is over that. And if a use goes in here that doesn't have a maximum parking limit, then none of this gets updated. So is that a benefit to the person moving in? Yes, because they don't have to take up this parking. But to the community who is looking for sites in this location to have some green, and some parking lot infrastructure to deal with the runoff that's happening on site, those types of things we get from limited compliance. And we can't compel a site like this to do those updates if there's no maximum parking, because under limited compliance, you have to meet the parking standards. One of those is maximum, and you only have to meet the impervious if you're over maximum parking. So it's the trigger for both things. So this is what I was kind of talking about, the balance, and I've had this conversation with other commissioners as well, where one easy thing to say is like, well, let's just make impervious surface, let's just do impervious surface then in limited compliance. But we kind of see that as like the extreme, that's the environmental end. It's like, yes, let's tell anyone who goes in here that they have to rip this up and meet 70%. And then the other end, is not having them do anything by not having a max parking, and that's the more business-friendly, arguably end. And so the way that the regulations are written now is the middle, right? So we're trying to ride that line between the two competing interests by saying, yes, anyone who goes in here you don't have to rip out so much of this, because getting this to 70% would be substantial, but you have to get as close as you can if you're over the amount of parking we would let you have if you had just built this. And so it's kind of confusing and it's a little wonky and it's not super fun to explain to people. And we are often in an awkward position because realtors don't always understand it and they don't explain. So then they're telling someone that they can move in here. And then when they call us and say, oh, we're ready to do it. And we're like, oh, well, great. You have to take out 10 spaces. That creates issues. So I think it's an education piece on something for us to be more active in educating those in the community who have that direct contact with potential users. But this is an example of why it's important to have those in a limited compliance situation. So in a limited compliance situation, we can have you bump down to your maximum parking number, but we can only compel you to get closer to your impervious surface or parking setbacks if you're over that number to begin with. So did I explain that properly?
So, Chris, I'll just say, every government agency, whether it's the building department, the fire department, the planning department, we all have our set of rules and regulations, and there are tons of things that were built prior to those regulations that are allowed to continue and exist, they're grandfathered, but you're always going to have some threshold that you cross that you've got to bring a property into compliance. Maybe you've got to put in a sprinkler system, you've got to put in your fire exits, you've got to put in landscaping. So the limited compliance standards are, that's what we have written, and this has been painstakingly done over a long time because these conversations are very difficult. When you tell somebody you've got to remove this, or you've got to plant this, or you've got to build a sidewalk, if we don't make something a law, no one's going to do it. We can suggest things, but I just don't have the money to do that. Well, the conversation just stops right there. So you have to make it a law, and you have to make it clear cut and predictable and fair. When you say, oh, the people across the street had to do the same thing, that makes it easier to swallow. I'm not being singled out. You can sit here and point to numerous situations. And here are the standards, and we try to make them as clear as possible so that it's not subjective. It's not, a hard conversation. It's, predictable.
Well, I appreciate giving the numbers on how many variants have been requested, which seems like a very low number, obviously. The thing that I'm fearful of is non-disclosure, people just moving forward and just kind of, obviously my method. I call you guys, you're on my speed dial on about every property. But I just don't want to create that atmosphere either, so. All right, well, no, thank you for that. So.
I want to just follow up on that. Looking at the property that you just showed up there, in some properties it's pretty clear, right, what's parking and what's other impervious surface. Now I can deduce that on the right side of the screen that's parking because there's white stripes on it. But how do what determines all that other impervious surface in the back is or is not parking?
No, that's a great question, and that's something that that's our starting point. So we say, here's your maximum parking number. Show me where those spaces are going. Show us, in this situation here where it looks like there's just asphalt every which direction and who knows what's being used. Delineate your parking spaces. Show us your maximum number of spaces, and then we'll work with you. If there are areas, hey, this is just not being used, you're over impervious surface, you've got to take it out. So there's a little bit of give and take, but it starts with the site plan that they give us based on that raw parking maximum number.
So are there scenarios where you go in and say, looks like there's a change of use taking place, and you say, well, it looks like your exceeding your parking maximum, and the property owner says, nope, that's not parking, that's storage. That's not parking, that's a turnaround area. And I, instead of tearing up that, I'm just removing the stripes and repurposing it for something else.
So that's a tough one, and that's a case-by-case kind of basis, and we work with them. If there's areas that we can clean up a little bit and still allow them to use the site in an efficient manner, get their number of parking spaces in there. But if we can clean it up, then the code helps guide us to that, to say, you have to take up some of the spaces, some of this impervious surface, some of this gravel. If it is outdoor storage, is it legitimately approved as that? Is it storage space, or is it just gravel that's kind of spread over time and should never really have been there to begin with?
What I'm hearing you say is that it's not cut and dry that you got to tear up concrete in every case, or tear up asphalt in every case.
There's a little bit of wiggle room, a little bit to work with property owners, for what they need, but it helps to have some definitive standards, and the max parking number is the biggest thing to start with. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Any other questions? Commissioner St. John.
So I have 3 questions. One, why did we not have limits last time? I can't remember. Why did we pass this and some didn't have limits? I understand trying to get everyone to have a limit. That makes sense if we're going to have limits, but why did we do that to begin with?
I think Clarion is something that they do, and we went back and looked at the different staff drafts where they still had the footnotes in. I don't know if anyone else is remembering how this was, but then they would put why they were making a change. So for these, for those that they changed, mostly the footnote said, use is typically self-limiting, and which is fine, and that was something that they had suggested to us that they had used in other places, and so I think we just kind of went along with it and maybe shouldn't. The other thing is the uses, again, like I mentioned, they identified were mostly the people-based uses from the 2019 code. So it was like getting away from that was a good idea, but we maybe should have pushed to say, like, we do want to propose limits here. And I think, almost immediately, at least like Mr. Volan on council was like, what are we doing this? But, as part of a omnibus change, it has not come forward kind of till now.
Thank you. And then
Is that, sorry, Mr. Grulich.
So Karen, so real quick, the no limit, it works great when you're starting from scratch and somebody is building a property that meets requirements. You've got parking in the back, you meet your minimum landscaped area. Then it regulates itself. It's the situations where we deal with these limited compliance, and we have to start with, you've got a situation like what's on the screen, or, something even worse, think of the mall, where you've got a building all the way in the back and it's just a sea of asphalt between that and the street. We have to have some number to start with to say, here's your max parking number, you've got to start taking things away. So in a new development, new construction situation, it's not an issue. The use regulates itself. You've regulated it through setbacks, minimum landscaped area, but it's the limited compliance stuff, which is what we deal with a lot and is the hardest, that the max parking number really it's almost a starting point.
But I will say, to amend that, well, as I said in the presentation, but large lots that we still need to develop, like the one on Fullerton, we need them for those, because those things that Eric mentions, or that we've talked about as a group, impervious surface coverage, setbacks, and those things, the parcel is so big that won't matter. They'll meet those things. If the rezone had gone through and they had built a jail property there, it literally would have been acres of parking, which is maybe appropriate. That would be something for, to decide, but we do think that there needs to be some sort of limit on that type of design. And again, this is for surface parking, so if parking garage is an approved use wherever this, hypothetical development is happening, that can happen, and then that is only limited by the design requirements of a parking garage.
okay, thank you. I do share some of the concerns of Commissioner Cochran and Commissioner Whistler, but I'm glad to hear that you do work with property owners in your response to Commissioner Whistler, so that's promising. So given that, just looking at some of these specifically, I just had a couple questions. I was curious why a meeting, banquet, event facility had 4 spaces per 1,000 square feet and a convention center has 2. They seem similar to me.
That's a good question. I think, okay, so a couple things. We're happy to change, and we're happy to take any proposals to change these. I think the idea is, and anyone can correct me if I'm wrong, that at a convention center conference, you're usually paired with other uses. So it's usually like convention center, restaurant, hotel, that it would be, that all of those uses kind of like add up and end up being kind of ancillary for each other. So you do get enough parking, and also they typically have parking garages that are separate. So because this is the regulation only for the surface parking, usually in a convention center situation, that would be more than one use together, and then also probably have structured parking as supportive. So I think that's why it's separate. Where like a meeting or banquet or event facility that's just on its own and that's all it is, needs more leeway because they're not having that shared parking with the other uses that typically pair with a convention center. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah. And then my last question, again, just looking at the details, I was looking at which ones had more per 1,000 square feet. So like a medical clinic has 5, and a grocery store has 5, and a sexually oriented business has 5. But a bar has, well, a bar would be different. In indoor, all other indoor recreation has 4. And so why does a sexually oriented business have 5? Again, no judgment on that kind of business. It's just, I was looking at ones that had the most, and I get a grocery store and a medical clinic, but I don't understand why that has 5. And yeah, the grocery store has 5.
That's a good question. Okay, so some of these, like for example, grocery store, like we did not look to lower any. So those that already existed, we were not planning to like right size any numbers, just as part of the conversation of being concerned about parking.
Okay, gotcha. So those seem odd to me, but since you're not right sizing, I see why you didn't change it.
Does that answer all your questions?
It does.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions from commissioners? All right. Is there any public comment on ZO-12-23? Don't see any here in the chambers. Is there any online? If you're online and you'd like to make comment, click on that reactions button, click the raise hand button, and we will recognize you.
No raised hands.
Last call for public comment. All right, we are back to the commission for any additional questions, comments, discussion, or a motion.
I'll motion. If there's, all right, motion to amend UDO ZO12-23 chicken flocks and table 4-10 and the maximum parking, and waive the second hearing and forward to the city council with a positive recommendation.
All right, the motion is that we approve the proposed amendments and forward to the city council with a positive recommendation and a waiver of the second hearing. Is there a second?
Second.
Any final comments or discussion before we call the roll? I'll just make one comment, which is to say I still don't love parking maximums, but I'm more convinced now than before. I think I appreciate your explanation. I was leaning towards trying to push for just an impervious surface, but I do see how that actually would be potentially more onerous on property owners. And I think it seems like the numbers in here are have kind of erred on the high side, and I think they seem pretty reasonable. I was very much on the fence, but I think I'm willing to support this tonight.
I'll say one other thing, too. I really appreciate the time the staff took to figure this out, the consultative process you took, and the fact that you worked with commissioners here to do it. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, second that. Commissioner Cochran.
Yeah, it's, I struggle with the parking issue, obviously, because I'm on the front lines dealing with property owners every day and also tenants wanting to get into buildings, and I know the challenges behind it. But I do appreciate you're responding to our comments and the separate meetings, so knowing that there's some leeway or some discussion that can be had, I was leaning towards just saying no, but I will support it, knowing that there's conversation and we're dealing with reasonable people. So, no, thank you for that. So,
Mr. Whistler, if I can add something, I just never remember to say this when we talk about this, but there is a provision in the code that allows for a petitioner to basically prove through a parking study that they need more parking outside of the variance process that Director Robinson can approve. And that's not something we've seen people really take a lot of advantage of, but that is something that was put in with the update to allow for more flexibility without having to, wait to go to the Board of Zoning Appeals or whatever
Yes.
for the obvious cases. So
Yes,
thank you. Sorry about
Thank you
that.
for pointing that out. I think that's important for all of our viewers to understand, but it is definitely an important point. Thank you. Any other comments? All right, let's call the roll.
Cochran,
yes.
Kinsey,
Yes.
Korodke,
Yes.
Smith,
Yes.
St. John,
Yes.
Whistler,
Yes.
Ballard,
Yes.
Burrell,
Yes.
Seabour.
Yes.
Great, thank you.
All right, motion carries, and that is our final petition for the evening. Thank you all for your patience. We are adjourned. We'll see you in May.